disruptive innovation is obviously it's become kind of a cliche, but it's misleading, and misleading in kind of a dangerous way, because the word disruptive means you know what it's going to do for a market, because disruptive is about changing a market. But the reality is that when you have these probably the biggest ideas in the world, no one had any idea what they would do for a market.
Hi, I'm James Taylor, business creativity and innovation keynote speaker, and this is The Creative Life, a show dedicated to you, the creative. If you're looking for motivation, inspiration, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's an author, musician, entrepreneur, performer, designer, or thought leader. They'll share with you their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, and much, much more. You'll find show notes for this episode, as well as free training on creativity, over at jamestaylor.me. Enjoy this episode. Hey there, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted today to have onto the show Safi Bahcall. Safi is the author of Loonshots. After studying physics at Harvard and Stanford, he founded a biotech company specializing in cancer drugs, led its IPO, and served as its CEO for 13 years. He was named the Ernst Young Entrepreneur of the Year in 2008, and in 2011, he worked with President Obama's Council of Science Advisors. It's my great pleasure today to have Safi with us. So welcome, Safi.
Thanks, James. Delighted to be here.
So share with everyone what's happening in your world just now.
Well, I'm gearing up for Loonshots. It's going to come out. It'll launch on March 19th. So there's just a flurry of activity. And then you may know this, you may know, you may not know, but when you write something, you just disappear. In my case, it was kind of into a cave, actually this little cave right here that you can see, little 8x8 box in my home, for 3 years. And I came from a very different, it was an incredible transition. When you're CEO of a public company, there's people calling you every minute of every day to, figure this out or figure that out or put out that fire. And you're on stage constantly. And then I just kind of checked out. And in some way, it was actually incredibly fun. It was, just an incredible transition to diving deep into history from, 17th century astronomy to ancient Chinese naval battles to World War II to, legendary figures, and seeing how one idea connects them all. But yeah, you disappear into a cave, and then now I'm kind of re-emerging from that cave into the real world, and it's a kind of a crazy experience. It's sort of fun.
So before we go into some of the parts of the book, we should probably define Loonshots. So you describe a loonshot as a neglected project, widely dismissed, its champion written off as unhinged. Can you remember your very first loonshot that you had? Maybe when you were younger, when everyone said, Safi, you are completely unhinged with this one.
I feel like that happens about 5 times a day. So. I think, even when I was writing this book, when I first started this book project, I remember telling people, I have this idea. I think, it connects movies, drugs, and baseball, and the fate of empires. And they're like, really? James Bond and Star Wars is connected to Lipitor and the statin drugs, and, A-Rod, and, now it's, Clayton Kershaw or Mike Trout. And all that tells us, is connected to the rise of the British Empire and the fall of the Qing dynasty. And they're like, really? Oh, look at that time. I gotta go.
I can imagine people at dinner parties started moving away from you gradually over the course of the evening. Back away. Exactly.
Back away. But, that's kind of what's fun about it. I think, and that's part of chasing after crazy ideas, the Loonshots of the world, is you've got to have some courage. You've got to recognize that guaranteed, no matter what happens, when you present your idea, people are going to be like, whoa, look at that time. Or, there's just no way this is going to work. I remember, even the title, Loonshots. I was trying to think of a word for a long time of like, there is a moonshot is a goal, a destination. Let's put a man on the moon. That was Kennedy in 1961. Or let's cure poverty, or let's solve world hunger. Those are big destinations, but they don't tell you how to get there. And nurturing Loonshots, those small, crazy ideas that nobody think will work, that's how you get there. And I remember I was trying to come up with I had long tail idea, or I was trying to think of a word for what happens in practice, which is when you're at a business or when you're working on an art project, you come up with these crazy ideas and people dismiss them all the time. But those are the really important ideas. To say, for example, that it's a disruptive innovation, that word kind of causes me a lot of gastrointestinal distress because disruptive innovation is obviously it's become kind of a cliche, but it's misleading and misleading in kind of a dangerous way, because the word disruptive means what it's going to do for a market, because disruptive is about changing a market. But the reality is that when you have these probably the biggest ideas in the world, no one had any idea what they would do for a market. Let's take, for example, the transistor. When it was discovered in 1947, people were just working on better switches. And they figured out, I can use a little semiconductor sandwich, and I think I might be able to make the switch. Were they trying to disrupt the market? No. They were just trying to make maybe better switches that might help the phone company. It was at AT&T at Bell Labs. They were trying to make better switches. Did they say, they didn't know what to do with it for the first 5 years. Finally, someone said, they were actually pretty expensive and they didn't work very well. So hearing aids are very small and you can't really fit. At the time, they had these tubes, vacuum tubes. You can't really. So they said, maybe we can use a transistor for a hearing aid. So we're the first people who worked on the transistor, which was really in many ways the invention of the century, of the 20th century. Were they saying, let's work on a disruptive innovation? For what market? The hearing aid market? Were they just trying to disrupt it? No. So disruptive innovation is a bit misleading, because anyone who's worked in business or even in arts, you have no idea where your crazy idea is going to go.
Yeah. You're creating sometimes for the sake of creating, because you're looking. This is interesting. I want to know why is that? Why just sometimes you don't necessarily have an end goal in mind apart from this looks interesting. I want to go a bit deeper on this.
What it does is it challenges beliefs. So I'll give you another example of where I think the term disruptive innovation is misleadingly used. So let's take Walmart. This is kind of a classic example if you look at kind of businesses and business history. You had all these retail stores around at the time and discount stores, and then Walmart came and just blew right through them. And they all disappeared, and Walmart is, got, 44 God knows how many stores and hundreds of billions of sales. It's I think if it was ranked on a list of countries, Walmart would be like I think it was like 18 by GDP. It's huge. So did Sam Walton begin with saying, what I really want to do is disrupt the discount industry? No, he wanted to be like a big city. When he was a young guy, he liked retail. He wanted to be a big city retail store guy. And his wife said to him, I'll support you, but I don't like these big cities. You can pick anywhere you want to live as long as it's less than 10,000 people. And I just don't like big cities. And he's like, okay, I'm married. And so, all right, I'll do that. And he happened to like quail hunting. So he picked Arkansas in the Northwest there, because it was on the border of 4 states, and he could have quail seasons all year round, and he could just jump from state to state and just have a good time. And then he discovered that there was this huge business from pricing things slightly cheaper in rural America, and no one had thought about that. He just said, maybe there's a chance that there is a little bit more here. Who knows? So with Sam Walton, and of course it grew astronomically, and he was absolutely right. He tapped into something that was completely unrealized, that there was this enormous demand in rural America. People would drive far for these big stores. So he didn't have any plan to disrupt an industry. He was just challenging some accepted beliefs.
In what you mentioned also at the start, and just talking about going into that cave for 3 years, and also I guess, with Sam Walton's wife giving him, or like Japanese poetry, giving an artificial constriction in which to kind of create something. You mentioned a quote in the start of the book. It's a Francis Crick quote, where he said, someone asked him what it takes to win a Nobel Prize, and he said, "Oh, it's very simple. My secret has been I know what to ignore," which we often think about adding things all the time, but it's like what to ignore. I'm interested, when you had to go into that kind of 3-year period of really digging down, what did you have to make a decision to ignore? What did you have to almost like say, okay, I'm putting this aside in my life, in my business, and everything I'm doing, in order to make the mental space to experiment and think about in a deep way some of these subjects?
Well, I had to ignore my mother asking me, when are you going to get a real job? So no, it was a whole series of ignoring. For example, even the title Loonshots, I had early on publishers saying, yeah, eventually I started thinking, well, maybe there's something in this whole thing, and then I suggested, now everybody loves it. In retrospect, they're like, oh, that's a great title. I know what it means. It's simple, and they're all excited. But back then, I remember getting a long lecture from some well-known editor or publisher guy, and he was saying, like, yeah, you see, you just can't use that title. You're really going to have to change it. I mean, I like your principle, because, what happens is, salespeople, they call bookstores, and the sales guy is going to say, oh, I have this book called Loonshots, and the bookstore guy is going to say, oh, did you say Moonshots? And the sales guy is going to say, no, it's Loon with an L. It's like, what, Moon? No, L. What, M? No, L. And he said, like, you just don't want to have that no, nobody's. Turns out they're totally wrong. Nobody. So you have to ignore. You will get sage advice from experts, and that's what you have to ignore. I think I remember there's another quote: "There are no experts of the future, only experts of the past."
That's a great quote. That's a fantastic. So as you were kind of going along, you were doing the research for this book, making all these discoveries. Was there a key point in it where so you had this maybe initial ideas around a book, but was there a key point you went, okay, this is it. This is the direction I want to go with the book. I'm going to center around this particular story or this particular fact that you discovered.
No.
Because
when you're creating something, and I'm sure other authors that but maybe some are different. They really map out their whole world, and of course, fiction is very different than nonfiction. Is also. In fiction, I think there are some authors that really map out their whole stories in advance. And then I know there are other authors that just like create these characters and then just try to figure out what they do. In nonfiction, I think there's a couple of, there's this, if you're doing a biography, it's pretty obvious. You start when the guy's born and you stop when the guy dies. Or if you're telling the history of jazz in America, you start to figure out. This was very different, and in fact, that was the hardest part. I really, how do I tell the story of this one idea about the behavior of groups, and you can apply some principles of physics and science to understand the behavior of groups, and that gives you a new way for understanding why groups suddenly change behavior, and all of that gives you a new way of designing more innovative teams or companies or nations. So how do you tell that story? If you didn't have my book, how would you tell that story?
And you're dealing with over long periods of time. I mean, you're not talking like the rise of Silicon Valley, for example, compressed period of time. You're talking big expanses. So what you're describing there is something called you're talking about phase transitions, which I'd never heard as a phrase before. So please educate me and educate some of our listeners, our viewers. What is phase transitions? Why should we care about this idea of phase transitions?
Well, it's interesting. If you think about the history of science, the history of physics, of thinking about the world around us, the last century was really about understanding either the extreme small, what happens inside an atom, inside a proton, inside a neutron, and quarks and electrons, or the extreme large, what happens in the universe, in the trillions and trillions of galaxies, and the dark matter and the dark energy in the universe. But and those are fascinating questions, and we made a lot of progress. But here's another question. This is a glass of water. Can you see this?
Yep.
Does this coming through? Now, if I stick my finger in, I can swirl it around and the water sloshes around. That happens for every liquid. I can always just swirl my finger around, except under one condition. If I change the temperature all of a sudden at a critical point, the water completely changes behavior. It becomes completely rigid.
The structure changes.
It completely transforms. But why? Those molecules are exactly the same. So how did they know to suddenly change? There wasn't a lead molecule, a CEO molecule saying be rigid today and be fluid tomorrow. They suddenly changed from completely fluid to totally rigid. And that's called the fluidity of liquids and the rigidity of solids is called an emergent behavior. You can't understand it just by analyzing one molecule on its own. It's something that appears or arises or emerges out of the collective dynamics of many. And so I found that there's an interesting way, actually first mathematically, but then you can understand that in more simple sort of plain English language, of understanding the behavior of large groups of people when they're organized into a team or a company or any kind of group with a mission and a reward system tied to that mission. If you adjust certain parameters of that organization or design, you will suddenly go through a transition in that organization. And that could help us understand why some organizations are wildly creative, and those same organizations will suddenly transform. The ones that are most widely praised, everybody admires them, they're on the cover of magazines. The next week you read about them in the toilet. They've missed these incredible breakthroughs. They go from embracing wild new ideas to rigidly rejecting them. And I show that you can understand that in the same way you think about the glass of water. There's a transition from a state in which they embrace all those people, those teams, those companies, embrace wild new ideas, get behind them, to a state in which they become rigidly bureaucratic and reject those ideas.
The first thing that springs to mind is what role does the environment play in that? You're talking about that glass of water. Obviously, if the outside environment changes, something gets really, really cold, the structure is going to, I'm guessing, is going to change. Is it primarily something that's driven in those organizations, something that's driven by environment, or is actually something else going on?
Well, that's a fascinating question. You put your finger right on it. So with water, it's temperature, right? As I adjust the temperature, at high temperatures, it's very fluid, and at low temperatures, it's very rigid. So why? Why does temperature affect it? And how does temperature affect it? And that's what becomes really interesting, is that we can work out the equivalent of temperature for teams. What are those? That's called a control parameter. What are those control parameters that we can adjust for teams, for organizational design, that move us from embracing wild new ideas to rigidly rejecting them? So here's how you can understand why water suddenly changes. So every phase transition in nature is a result of two competing forces. There's like a tug of war between two forces. And in the case of water, those forces are binding energy, which wants to lock every molecule rigidly in place, like every water atom, 2.8 angstroms, not 2.7, not 2.9 angstroms from the next water. And entropy, which wants to make them all run around and be free. So one wants to lock them in place, one wants them to run around. These are two competing forces. As you adjust temperature, entropy gets weaker and binding energy gets stronger until, boom, they cross. That's when the system snaps and water freezes. And after that, at much lower temperatures, it's completely rigid. So every phase transition in nature is a result of two competing forces. And as you dial these parameters, you cause that transition. So that's what happens inside teams and companies. Imagine you're at a small company. Let's say you're at a biotech, James, and you now, instead of being, a podcaster, you are a cancer drug researcher. It's a 20-person company, and you've got a cancer drug. So everybody at that company cares enormously about making that drug succeed. You care. Let's say you have a relative with cancer. You have your friends, your spouses. You want to tell them that you've made a contribution. So your stake in that outcome is enormous. If you succeed, you're a hero, not to mention a millionaire, because there's 20 people. If the drug works, everybody's a millionaire. If you fail, you're unemployed. So everybody's stake in outcome is enormously high. And that's one force when you organize people into groups. It's their stake in the outcome. So your stake in outcome when you're at a small company is enormously high, which means you rally around that project. Every crazy idea stumbles and fails many times, like an early cancer drug, or a small, an early crazy idea for a movie, or a crazy idea for a book, or a crazy idea for a new business. They all struggle in their. But you know what? If you're at a 20-person company, everybody's stake in outcome is enormously high. You're going to rally around it. What's the other force? Perks of rank. So let's say you're the team captain, you might make a slightly bigger salary, right? Maybe you make an extra $5,000 a year. So the two forces are perks of rank and stake in outcome. Now, if you're at a very small company, your stake in outcome is enormous. So you'll embrace that crazy idea, that new cancer drug or that crazy business, and everybody's going to rally around it. Now, let's say your company gets bigger and bigger. You go from 10 people, 20 people, 100 people, 1,000 people. Just to imagine the extreme. Let's say you're Pfizer. You're 50,000, maybe 100,000 people. And it's the same you. It's the same James Taylor. And it's the same project, the same cancer drug. But now what's your stake in outcome? Well, if the drug works, maybe it's, $500 million a year, which is a good drug. But Pfizer's sales are what? $50 billion a year. So your stake in the outcome is now about 1%. On the other hand, if you can sound smart at meetings and kind of make sarcastic comments that kind of put down new projects, and that it sounds very thoughtful and you sound kind of wise, you might get promoted. And if you get promoted, you might get a bump in salary by 30%. So your stake in your perks of rank are now huge compared to your stakes of outcome. So somewhere between the startup and Pfizer, those two forces cross, just like temperature and water. Stake and outcome, perks of rank, they cross. And when they cross, boom, the organization changes. Instead of embracing wild new ideas like a tiny startup, you have people who now focus on sounding good at committee meetings.
So if someone's listening to this, the one that immediately springs to mind is like Richard Branson with the Virgin Group. He always... Anytime it gets above 50 people, he breaks it down. He never wants groups larger than 50 people for various different reasons. So in that, if you were the CEO of Pfizer, you've got a lot of background in the biomedical side, and cancer, looking for drugs for cancer. If you were to reorganize Pfizer in order to give it the best chance to succeed, to come up with those Loonshots, come up with those ideas that are going to transform and help people's lives, what would you do then?
Well, it's like you say with Branson. In fact, Google did something somewhat similar a few years ago when they split up into Alphabet and then all these separate businesses, a search business, a life science business, and so on. And Branson has obviously done that very successfully, splits up into small businesses with very low corporate main overhead. But interestingly, it's size, just like what size is one of these things that you can control. So obviously smaller groups, it's for very obvious reasons. You have more stake in outcome, and perks of rank matter a lot less. But everything has, all phase transitions have more than one control parameter. So I'll give you an example. Do you get snow where you are in England?
We've actually just had a whole ton of snow.
Okay, good. Because I was just telling kind of an audience in California this kind of snow story, and then I finished the story and I have just like total blank stares. I'm like, what? I don't know.
As they stare at you in their flip flops.
Yeah, and then I'm like, oh, these guys have never seen snow. That's why this story is totally useless here. All right, that's why I was just quickly checking. No, so when it snows overnight, what do you sprinkle on your driveways or sidewalks?
You usually put salt.
Right. The reason you sprinkle salt on your driveways is because it lowers the freezing point of water. So it's less likely to freeze. So you're less likely to slip and hurt yourself. You just get you'll wet your shoe. So salt, the density of salt in water is another control parameter, like temperature. Pressure is a third control parameter. So what you find once you really understand a phase change, a phase transition, is that there's more than one control parameter. So also for companies, there's more than one control parameter. You can work out which each of these control parameters are. So size is one. So you asked about direct relation to Pfizer. So it turns out there are 4 control parameters for companies. So you want to break up into small groups. That's one. I'll give you an example of a second one. So a second one you might call return on politics. So what is return on politics? Return on politics means how much, if you, James, are at Pfizer and you decide to invest your time in lobbying your boss, in schmoozing your boss, in sitting, listening to his stories and making him feel good, and maybe also putting down the guy down the hall who's your competitor and the other guy down the hall, how much does that affect your promotion decision? How susceptible is your boss to politics? Sounds like a weird thing, and everybody's different. But if you think about it, on average, every company might have a number. There'll be another. Some guys are more, some guys, but on average, there will be some. And when they say some companies are less political, that's what they mean. Their average return on politics is lower. I expected Richard Branson's company, politics doesn't do much. Results matter a lot more. So here's an example of of what I mean. Let's imagine 2 companies. One is where the boss makes every promotion decision. So you, James, are up for promotion. Let's say you're working on either a kid, you got a new project that you're working on, but you have a competitor down the hall and another one, upstairs, and 5 or 10 competitors in your office, and there's all one promotion. Who makes that promotion decision? Well, if it's your boss, what are you going to be doing? You're going to be like politicking him all year long, so that, putting down your colleagues and trying to, pump up yourself so that your boss does it.
Meanwhile, your competitor at another company is just going screaming ahead, not having to perhaps deal with some of those things.
Right. Now, here's, some company, let's say at Google or at McKinsey where I worked on, they actually take the boss completely out of the promotion decision. So they fly in somebody from another city who's an independent, who doesn't know you, who doesn't know your boss, and they just spend 3 weeks doing interviews. And they ask your colleagues, your people who you think are your peers or your competitors, your boss, your clients, your customers, people who work for you. So tell me about James. And they form a very thoughtful, independent, fair assessment of James. And then that person goes back and makes a recommendation to an independent group, and that determines the promotion. The boss has nothing to do with it. Now, in that second company, what's the return on politics?
It's going to be 0.
Very low.
Yeah.
0. So are you going to spend time lobbying your boss and saying how great your work is and how crappy the work is of your competitor down the hall? No. What's the point? You're just going to focus on doing the best job you can. And by the way, you're going to try to help your neighbor out. Why? Because they're going to be interviewed about you too. So that's an example of a second control parameter. What's the average return on politics across the company? Companies that are very political are going to crush new ideas. Why? Because when they're very political, you're going to try to crush the ideas of your neighbor down the hall, and he's going to try to crush your ideas. Every new idea arrives covered in flaws and warts, so those weaknesses are easy to find. So in companies that are very political, where the return on politics is very high, you're going to spend a lot of your time trying to crush each other's ideas, which means not many good ideas are going to survive, because all crazy ideas have flaws right in the beginning.
And also, as you're saying this, I'm wondering, I was just reading Ray Dalio's book, Principles, and at REAS company, they do a really interesting thing where every meeting is video recorded and transcribed as an AI transcription service. So with the exception, I believe, of HR, with people setting salaries, everything else is available to anyone else in the employee. And the thing I was wondering there was, well, that's interesting. I wonder now if, because he believes so much in HR and machine learning, that it's getting to learn his principles in order to make investment decisions based around his principles. So I'm now thinking in terms of what you're talking about, some of these competing forces, teaching machines how to see these competing forces so it can essentially spider into companies and say, okay, you have some you have some challenges here. These are the things that the red light starts to go on because it can start to see all those kind of conversations.
Yeah, I think that, that's right. You want to think people have spent, if you're trying to think about innovation in teams and companies and groups, there's been an enormous amount written about culture. But if you think about like the glass of water, does culture have anything to do with why it's fluid or rigid? No, it's just the temperature. It doesn't matter, it doesn't matter how much one molecule is sitting there yelling at his neighbor. As the temperature is lowering, it doesn't matter if one molecule is saying to his neighbors, hey, everybody, loosen up, run around, be free. As you cross 32 Fahrenheit, ice is going to crystallize around that molecule no matter what he's saying. So, I think, one of the messages here is that structure matters as much or more than culture.
Yeah.
So people have spent all this time on culture, and they haven't thought as much about the kind of organizational design elements. So what are people's real incentives here? Are there incentives to focus on politics and trashing their neighbors and trashing ideas and promoting themselves? Or are there incentives to get behind some crazy idea? So this is really more about, in some ways, it's more like the behavioral economic stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So I was just thinking, and so as we, so fascinating, structure v culture. I definitely want to dive a bit further into that at some point as well. But I'd love to, just as we start to going to go into the final part of this interview, you talked about having to kind of go deep as you were looking at all these things, seeing the different connections. Was there a online resource or a tool, an app you found very useful in your creative process as a writer? Because you're having to absorb huge amounts of information from different places, different sources. What were any tools very useful for you in this process of writing this book?
Yeah, I mean, there was a process that was enormously helpful that I, without having, that process was a lot of trial and error to arrive there. And that was enormously helpful. A mindset that was enormously helpful. And then some organization, like organization is a weapon. And the organizational system that I developed was what made it possible. I spanned 3,000 years of history in 15 different fields. There's no way I could have done it without a pretty systematic organizing process.
Talk to me about it, because I've seen different writers, people like Ryan Holiday, have their little cards wherever they write different things on cards. Different people use things like Evernote. Some people, just write them out, whiteboard things, all different types of. So what were your kind of organizational principles, I guess, for creating this work?
Well, one was a process and mindset, and the other was how I organized the research. So this was a research-heavy book. I went very deep in a lot of areas of history, far more than made it into the book. I probably wrote and researched 10 or 20x of what actually went into the book. I cut, a ton of things that didn't help advance the story and make it kind of, my goal was to make it an entertaining read, like that's what a lot of people said. It's like reading a mystery thriller. Each chapter transitions to the next and there's no let up in pace. So to do that, there was a ton of research that I did, and I only kept maybe 5 or 10%. And to do that, firstly, I digitized everything. So where I could get books digitally, I would get them digitally. Where they were only available in hard copy, I would often scan electronically whatever portions I needed, or get an assistant to help scan it in. And then I organized it. I had probably 400 folders in a hierarchy of different fields and disciplines and subdisciplines, probably 5,000 documents in those, several hundred folders. And each folder has a Word file that's a master note file that's organized in terms of highlights and quotes that I may want to use and supporting themes and which sources in that folder. So it's a system of electronic folders organized in a hierarchy that was easy to understand, with essentially a notebook for each one of them where I captured the relevant ideas. And I would have everything electronically. And then there is a tool that you can define a database of files and folders on your computer. The one I use is called Copernic for Windows. There's an equivalent one for Apple. I forgot the name. And you just type you set the boundaries that it will only search that database of your research files and folders, not anything else on your computer. And then I could type a phrase, say a name, like, just pick any name, Albert Einstein or Harry Truman, and it would just instantly list all the files, which is the books, research papers, journal articles, note files that mention that name, or, word A plus or minus 10 words of word B. And you could create complex queries, and then it would turn up all the documents, and then you'd see a preview. So that allowed me, as soon as I had some idea about connecting two things, I could instantly find the research article.
I really hope you're keeping some of these things in backup drives, because I often think when you look at the work of Mr. Churchill or other writers, you can see all their notes as they're working up. It's all written notes, and those things keep for a certain amount of time. And I often think all these digital notes that everyone makes, that could just get lost overnight, and we think, well, what was his thinking? How did he arrive at that chapter? What was the things that he had to go through, the questions he had to ask himself? And so I hope you're backing that up for the future, because it sounds like there's maybe some other books there. So you mentioned jazz. I'm interested if you could recommend just one album and also one book that you think our listeners should check out. What would those be?
I love Nina Simone. I mean, I don't know why. Music is very personal, but her stuff just really moves me. I could listen to, if I had to take one record to a desert island or whatever, it would be, the Nina Simone's like greatest hits collection or whatever. Books, I mean, I have read so many. It's just so hard to even start. I'd say it depends kind of what you're looking for. So I divided my reading into two groups of reading. I called one Rickles and one REAS. So Rickles is reading for information, content, lessons. Rickles. So those were, data, things that I would use for sources for stories. And then REAS is reading for ear, art, and skill. And so there I would just read for ear. I would learn. I found a few authors whose writing just enormously resonated for me. And then part of my practice was, I had a pretty rigid routine in the days. And when my kids go to bed at 8 p.m. and my wife is kind of knocked out from, getting up at 5 a.m., I have a couple hours free. So I would usually either at home or just go to one of the restaurant bar counters on here in Mass Ave in Cambridge, sit down, and I pull out one of these 2 or 3 authors. I might spend 2 hours on a paragraph. Why? Everybody says use active rather than passive. So why did he use passive voice? Why did he put this word in this part of the sentence, not here? Why did he use this transition between sentence A and B, or the end of this paragraph, not a more classic transition? And I would just try to rewrite it and see why it got worse every time you rewrite it. And then you say, oh, that's why he did that. And after doing that day after day after day, all of a sudden I would start reading, and when I would read, I would hear it as music. I would either hear just amazing harmony and rhythm and cadence, or just clashing sounds like I would have to cover my ears. It just sounded so grating. And it would just instantly appear when things were off or when things had perfect rhythm. So the one book that was probably the most influential on the REAS side was Nabokov's short stories. I just could not get enough. A friend sent that to me once, and I read the first, one story, the first couple sentences, and my jaw dropped. I said, I just cannot believe the English language can do this. I'd never seen anybody do that with the English language. And for a year, I would just analyze paragraphs from Nabokov's short stories. And I was like, how the freaking hell did this guy do that? That's just unbelievable.
Well, we're going to put that link here, and also put the link to Nina Simone, the greatest hits as well. I want you to, Safi, I want you to imagine you woke up tomorrow morning and you're going to have to start from scratch. So you have all the skills, all the knowledge you've acquired over the years, but no one knows you. You know no one. You're going to have to restart. What would you do? How would you restart things?
Oh, I've got book number 2. I can't wait to book number 2 and book number 3. I cannot wait to get started on them. So I'm actually, thank you for asking. It makes me feel good and smile. It's like, really? I can do something new now? This is awesome. I can't wait to get started. They're crazy ideas, and they're big ideas, and they're going to be a ton of fun. I can't wait to go. I've emerged from the cave and I'm back in the real world. I can't wait to turn off the lights, close the shade, go deep, deep, deep into the rabbit hole of creating these weird, crazy stories and ideas and bringing them all together. So thank you for asking that question. I feel great now.
Well, before you go back into that dark cave, I just want to thank you so much, Safi, for coming on the show. If people want to get their copy of the book, pre-order and order their copy of the book, and also learn more about you and the other things that you're involved in, where's the best place for them to go and do that?
Just go to loonshots.com.
Loonshots.com. And we'll also have all of the show notes here. You go to jamestaylor.me and you'll be able to search for Safi Bahcall, and you'll be able to find all of the show notes that we've been speaking about today as well. Safi, thank you so much for coming on today. Thank you for sharing all about your creative life.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
If you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.